Good evening, everyone. I would like to call the April 19th work session of the Croton-Harmon Board of Education to order and recommended action that the Board of Education approves the agenda as presented.
So moved.
Second. On the question? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain? Motion carries. We will move into new business. Recommended action that the Board of Education approves the 2022-2023 property tax report card for the Croton-Harmon Union Free School District as presented.
So moved.
Second.
On the question? All in favor? Aye. Oppose? Abstain? Motion carries. Recommended action that the Board of Education adopts the 2022-2023 Croton-Harmon Union Free School District budget in the amount of $52,672,111.
No move.
Second.
Okay, and I will turn it over to Ms. Harrington Cohen to give us an update on the budget.
Thank you, Sarah. I got it from here, Tracy. Thank you. So good evening. Tonight, we will be bringing to you one more time the superintendent's proposed budget for the 22-23 school year. The Board of Education will be asked to adopt the budget this evening, at which point it will become the Board of Education's proposed budget. And then it will go to voters on May 17th to become the community's budget. As you know, we've been through this budget in great depth a number of times already, so this is going to provide just a brief overview for you this evening. And I will begin with state aid and budget updates. As many of you know, the budget came in just a little over a week ago, about 9 days late. Here I've presented just some of the relevant data to Croton-Harmon. So it maintains the restoration of foundation aid at 50% phase-in. So for Croton-Harmon, it's an additional $750,000. Also, the universal pre-K grant expansion. We currently have 36 eligible students. The grant has been expanded to include additional funding, which as we get more information through the budget process, we will inform the community and parents. But it looks as though we would have an additional 15 to 18 spots available for eligible pre-K students. Also, there have been no formula changes to expense-based aids. We were very concerned about that, putting a cap on that. That was no action was taken there. There is a STAR exemption credit now. So if you earn under 250,000, you're eligible for a standard STAR, and under 92,000 is enhanced STAR. And there's a website that I have on the presentation that you can visit for more information. Then they're also included in the budget is the zero emission school bus requirement, whereby all purchases of school buses and any school vehicles by 2027 must be purchased as zero emission electric, with the full fleet requiring EV by 2035. Lastly, there was a retiree income waiver through June 2023, with the Great Resignation and many retiring from the field. They've extended the income waiver to 2023, allowing retirees to work in school districts and not have to be under the salary cap. And also vesting for retirees in tier 5 and 6. It has gone from 10 years to 5 years now, and that's for TRS and the employee retirement system. For both, yes. Some of what was missing. So as some of you may be aware, for the past year and a half, we have provided free meals to all students. With the federal government not extending that, there was a request to the state to provide universal meals. That was not approved. Also, about a year and a half ago to 2 years ago, they increased the maintenance cost for residentially placed students. It's quite a hefty bill. So one of our residentially placed students, the tuition could be upwards of 100,000. We are then also required to pay 58% maintenance on that $100,000. So that was not written into law, but it was extended for another year. So we will be looking at that 58% as opposed to the previous, which was, I believe, 35%. Also, they did not extend the caps on career and tech salaries, which limits our BOCES funding. Also, there was a proposal to extend the capital outlay threshold from 100,000 to 250,000, which would be a relief to school districts. That was not enacted. And then also transparency reporting, which is a redundant report comparable to the ESSA report. They were talking about removing that requirement and they did not. So I will briefly just go over our proposed revenue budget. There are no significant changes from our last budget meeting, with the exception of the state aid came in approximately 19,000 lower than we had anticipated. So in order to absorb that loss, we added additional 19,000 to our appropriated fund balance and reserves. We have our expenditure budget in the amount of 52,672.11, which brings us to the overview. So on May 17th, we will ask the voters to approve the budget and the affiliated tax levy. The budget will be for 52,672.11. Also, proposition number 2 will be for the bus bond anticipation note for a 66-passenger electric vehicle and 1 minibus, an internal combustion engine, not to exceed an amount of $447,800. The third proposition is for the establishment of a capital reserve for transportation purposes. This is a $2 million reserve for a 10-year term, which would enable us to set aside reserves for the purchase of student transportation vehicles and also for the infrastructure upgrades necessary to move us towards electrification and the governor's goals. I will say that this proposition has no additional tax increases, and also the repair reserve as well, which is a not to exceed amount of 100,000. This reserve will allow us to defray some of the costs related to capital upgrades and infrastructure repairs. That also has no tax implications for this year. Followed by the library budget of $915,861. And then, of course, 2 Board of Education trustee seats. This is just a picture of the ballot, what you'll see on the ballot when you come on May 17th. And then finally, for our proposed budget overview, we have a budget of 52,672,111. That is a proposed tax levy increase of 1.92, which is below the mean for our region, in the amount of 42,221,342, and within the allowable tax levy. Lastly, some of our budget events. We have 2 events remaining. May 5th will be our official public budget hearing, followed by the vote on May 17th. And then, of course, all of our presentations, both slides and videos, are on our website, along with our social media links and QR codes. Any questions you can send to budget.questions@chucksd.org. And don't forget to vote.
Thank you very much, Denise. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question about the expansion of the universal pre-K.
Yes.
Does the current space that we're in right now allow for 15 to 18 more students?
We do believe so, yes.
Thank you.
Are we in contract with Happy Hearts for that program every year? And or is does an RFP get?
We issued an RFP last year for that, and I believe there is an up to 5-year extension on that RFP.
I'm sorry, I just have one more question. With respect to the zero emission buses, I had read that Governor Hochul had allowed potentially for some exemptions.
Yeah, you can apply for a 2-year waiver.
Thank you.
We are very fortunate. We're one of the few districts in all of New York State that has already purchased an electric vehicle and begun this transition. So we're in a very good position.
Any other questions? All right. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Oppose?
Who,
It was
I
moved
move.
by Neil and seconded by Omar.
Yeah.
thank you.
All in favor?
I,
Aye.
Oppose, abstain, motion carries. All right, we will now move into 2.3. Recommended action that the Board of Education approves the agreement for services with Croton-Harmon Union Free School District and Dr. Judy Wilson as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Second. All right. On the question? I believe we have Dr. Wilson here with us this evening. Welcome, Dr. Wilson. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, good evening, Judy Wilson, and thank you, President. I'm very happy to be with the Croton-Harmon Board, and I've been learning a lot about your good work. So thank you for allowing me to join you this evening.
If I
Mary,
could-
will you- oh, I'm
If I
sorry.
could say a couple of things in introduction of Dr. Wilson, and then of course, we're happy to take questions. I think we would all agree that one of the most important aspects of our work as leaders of the district is to develop a visionary and future-focused strategic plan that becomes part of the DNA of the district and becomes part of what's critical in terms of evaluating the decisions that we make and our ability to communicate to our students, our faculty, our staff, and the community about where we want the district to be headed over the course of the next few years. And in figuring out how we want to go about the process of developing the next iteration of that kind of strategic plan, following particularly the profile of the graduate that's become such a key part of what happens here. John and I spent a good deal of time thinking through the kind of person that we think is best positioned to help to facilitate that work alongside us. Spent several occasions speaking with organizations and other individuals, and we're thrilled to have been able to have been connected with Judy, who is a retired superintendent, having served, I think, 18 years in that seat. So you have my great respect for that. First and foremost, Judy, the last 8 years of her career as a superintendent were in the Princeton, New Jersey school system, and since then has been helping to facilitate this kind of work in a range of districts, more locally, Edgemont, Ossining, Pelham, North Shore, Long Island, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Westport, Connecticut, between strategic plans, long-term plans, and strategic goal formulation. She also mentors building and central office leaders in a number of districts. And when we spoke to the districts that Judy's done this work in, they described her exactly as we've already found her. Bright, thoughtful, engaged in this work, and possessing the kind of demeanor that we think will connect really well with our school district community. It was also shared with me that Judy's adept at navigating conflicting opinions, which John and I didn't offer her the chance to show us during our conversation.
Not have to referee, no.
I'm very, very pleased to recommend her for appointment. Look forward, pending the board's approval, to collaborating with you, Judy, and we're happy to take any questions the board has between John, Judy, and myself.
Mary?
Great. I only have 2 questions for you, and then I actually just want to have a conversation with the board also. But nice to meet you, Dr. Wilson.
Very good to be with you.
Yeah, whoever wants to answer it, but are we, first of all, tonight, are we, there's 2 documents on the website. One of them is an agreement with Dr. Wilson, and one is a proposal for strategic plan development. Are we voting on both of those today? So the plan, the strategic plan, the plan for the plan, the plan for the building, is that because in the what you just proposed is, it sounds like we're approving the agreement.
We are approving on the agreement, the contract agreement that is for the board to approve.
So the proposal for strategic plan
Is
development.
for
that
us
was
to
attached.
understand what the process will be.
But that's not what we're voting on tonight.
No, we are
So
voting on the contract.
not the plan.
Right, we aren't voting on the plan. We are voting on the contract.
Okay,
I think
okay. And then are we engaging in a strategic plan or a long-term plan?
I don't necessarily see them as fundamentally different.
Okay.
I think the terminology that we have used in our system that we want to continue to use is strategic plan.
Is there a difference in timelines of what you're thinking?
No,
in terms of how
either
long the
really
plan covers
typically
it?
either one would be between 3 and 5 years.
3 and 5, okay.
So I don't see that they are fundamentally different on there.
Okay. And then I wanted to just use this time because this is the first time the board has been presented with the strategic plan. We haven't had any discussion about it. When I first thought it was coming up, I thought there was going to be a conversation about it. So I was just curious what the board thought when they looked at the plan and the agreement and engaging in this work in terms of the board's role in this process and the district's role. If anyone had any comments on that?
I would be happy to jump in and describe the board's role in this work, if you would like me to.
That would be great. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, just didn't want to, I can't see everyone at the table easily enough to know that I don't want to interrupt anyone, but first of all, thank you for your service. I was highly dependent for 19 years on great board members by my side and teaching me and leading with me over the course of 2 districts. And so I know that sometimes it's a role and a job that you don't get a lot of gratitude for on the street. So thank you for the service. It's critically important to great school districts like yours. The board's role really comes in first of all in forming a process which is inclusive and which is not determined. The board doesn't sit and determine the educational goals in isolation. Not at a workshop, not a superintendent doesn't do it in isolation in his office. This is one that has a lot of voice and inclusivity in terms of all stakeholders. Students, parents, support staff, community members without children in the schools. I mentioned students, but students in grades 5 through 12. So a highly inclusive process in terms of voice, ideas, opinions. In terms of the specific roles of the board, clearly you're responsible for the business side of it, but the educational side of it is not just ensuring that the district is always leaning forward and being aspirational, but looking at that process for the inclusivity, for the divergent thinking, and for the multitude of voice. In terms of each board member's role, obviously you would all complete surveys that are available to parents and community members. I will conduct a one-to-one conversation, like a lead, not really an interview, but a lead conversation with each board member in the early phase of this work to hear your particular views, confidentially, anonymously, but to hear your particular views on where you see the current strengths of the district, the foundational work upon which we can build, and where you particularly see the needs, where you would like to see the high impact goals and the priority areas of work be over the next 3 to 5 years. And then there is a core team of key thinkers and leaders from all stakeholders, again, including students, support staff, parents, and board members. And so typically 2 to 3 board members will serve on that core team also. So I think lots of avenues for board members, as well as just being the guiding force and the kind of overseers of the entire process.
Thank you for that explanation. I really don't see that in the plan. I don't see the board's oversight or the board being included in actually making it inclusive, so that voices and ideas and opinions are represented. It looks like in the proposal that the superintendent identifies who's on those teams.
Mhm.
It clearly says that.
It does. Right.
And, yeah, so, I appreciate and I would hope that is the role of the board.
I
It is.
I think it also talks about how there are board members that are part of that team and that there were one-on-one interviews conducted with the board as well, so that there was
Right.
inclusion of the board in the process.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what Judy said though was that the board makes sure that it's inclusive of voices, ideas and opinions across the district that are included.
Mhm.
I don't see that in the plan that the board that's their role. It looks like it's the superintendent's role. So if that's not, this is a perfect time for us to discuss this, if you see it differently, because I don't
I
see
don't know,
that.
I'm sorry, I think I'm confused.
Yeah, go ahead.
What didn't you don't think that the board, I guess I'm confused as to what
The board is not part of the process of identifying
of identifying the members of the
the
Oh.
committee.
voices, the
Of who
opinions. that are
sits on the core team. So
Yeah.
typically that is the charge. I mean, the board's role is the process, the commitment to the process, the business side of the process to sit in. You will have representatives of the board on the core team, but very much on the administrative side, it is the superintendent's charge to compile, not without input from the board president or the board, but to compile a cross-section of people of goodwill, divergent thinkers who are able to see the system K-12 from a wide angle lens and to think forward together. So yes, I mean, because by definition and role, that is the superintendent's job to think about the administrative end and the systemic end of creating the process, but not without board input and not without board representation.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Mary, I view, again, that selection as an operational responsibility that I have and an opportunity that I have. In terms of the strategic planning process itself, I would encourage the board not to think about the details of that tonight simply because they haven't been presented yet in detail. So what I would encourage the board to think about is our recommendation that Judy is the right person to help us facilitate the process. And then the next time we're together in this room, it's my intention to share our view of the process, start to finish with the board, and then engage in discussion to the extent that there's questions or suggestions that the board has about the process as we get started.
Mhm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I was just going to add in reaction to what Mary said, I think there's two other things that may be occurring during this process. The first is, as Judy said, there are two to three board members who will be on that core group. So among the things that those board members on behalf of all of us will be considering is does the core committee and the work being done capture all of the various voices that we feel, as a governing body ought to be presented and ought to be participating. And also from my experience, when we went through this process, yes, it was probably 6 or 7 years ago, there's also a lot of opportunity for those outside the core group to be participating in terms of gathering information and in terms of, whether it's thought exchange, which I know we've used, or other surveys or comments and things to consider so that the product will have those thinking, which is guided, of course, by our goals, our district goals. And I think some of the things that we have had presented by John in terms of, transformational work that we hope will be occurring and that we aspire to have occurring. So it does all kind of fit in the end. But I do understand that the development of the plan is really like any other superintendent's committee or district committee, not our committee, and therefore, we rely on the educational leaders to move us forward in the way that that we would like to see.
Right, okay, good. So, I mean, because I guess this is, again, the first time I've seen the strategic plan outline, the approach. And the only place it says where where the board is actually included is in individual one-on-one interviews. So I encourage when you detail this out, that you insert there where the board comes in to be partners in that
Happy to do
plan.
that.
That would be helpful.
Happy to do that.
Thank you. And also, I just want you to consider with the one-on-one interviews, I mean, I having been on the board now for almost a year, I think one of the benefits is that there's 7 people that are supposed to come together and act as one body. And so having conversation together with the board about this topic, I think would be helpful. So if that's at work sessions, that's fine, but you know, the one-on-one individual, I think it should also be a collective body to have discussions and feed off each other and learn from each other. Because I think that works really well.
Well, I would anticipate that as the process goes through, we would have updates and we would have presentations at board meetings where there would be an opportunity for the full board, outside of the board, right? The board liaisons who are representing the full board in the core group would obviously be updating the board throughout the process, but there would also be public like updates and presentations where the board would be able to engage in that conversation.
It's not obvious to me being
Right.
new to this, so let's make it obvious.
And I would also assume that, Dr. Wilson, part of the reason that you want to have that one-on-one conversation with each of the board members is to understand the different perspectives that each of us have, you know, on challenge, so to speak, and so it's because it's confidential, and then you'll have a picture of what each of us see as the things that are most important, the things that we really want to focus on. And I would like to focus on, or Mary would, and then kind of helps Grant, just as you will with the other key administrators and other stakeholders that mentioned in the outline.
That's exactly right. And, you know, I want to stress that this is a little bit different in every district. You have a very strong base upon which to build. We'll certainly have a great springboard from the work that you've done with Portrait of a Graduate and a lot of the professional learning work that you've been so engaged in, even throughout the last couple of very challenging years. But it clearly is great timing, not just because of new leadership, not just because of an expired strategic plan, so to speak, but because we've learned a lot about our students, about our teachers, about the art of teaching and learning in the last years. And it really has given us a lot to reflect upon and to be, I think, sharper about our goals and ensure that after, you know, some time now that's been a little bit fragmented in many ways, we have clear and common goals to kind of fortify our work and gather our energy around and really leap forward with.
So this will be what's leading into the district goals that we talked about. That will be new coming this summer, right, for next year?
Correct.
Yeah, I think this will absolutely be a factor in that, and particularly, again, as we start to develop the budget for the following year, this kind of work drives that decision-making as well.
Yeah, so just to answer your earlier question there, having been involved in a few strategic plans before, I think there are few elements that make it, I think, more successful than other attempts. One is having a really good facilitator is really, really important. And I think if the administration is recommending, you know, Dr. Wilson, I'm fully in support of that decision. Then the next part is having a really clear and coherent roadmap, right? I think this is what this document does. It's kind of a roadmap of what the steps that will be taken to undergo the analysis. And the board as a component is one part of the stakeholder groups that will be involved, and that's my expectation, among many, right? And I think, you know, some responsibilities fall definitely on the superintendent and administrative team, others fall on us. I think as we were discussing previously about the goals and the plan, I think it's going to be an iterative process, or at least my expectation is that it'll be an iterative process where we provide input, Stephen and the leadership team provide input, and among other stakeholder groups, and together that formulates the strategic plan or the next strategic plan. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So as a project management professional, I looked at this plan, I said, this is a good plan for a plan.
Yeah.
One of the things that when you're embarking on something that is a large effort, what we're really talking about here is embarking on a 5-year effort. We're not talking about building a plan. We're talking about 5 years of work that we're going to do as a result of that plan. And whenever you're doing something, it's going to be a project, that's going to be a 5-year project. You don't just need a plan, you need a plan for the plan, and you probably need a plan for the plan for the plan. Simply because you need to sort of bootstrap it up in that way in order to get to enough detail. But you can't start out with all of that detail. And the one thing about plans is that no plan, as anyone knows, no plan survives contact with whatever the task that it is being planned about. That's as true on the battlefield as it is in schools, it's true anywhere. The moment when you actually start working on things evolve. I see, and that's why I think the plan proposal document that we have here is not part of the contract. Because it gives us the flexibility to evolve it, to iterate on it. And that iteration is a really super key part. And I think that I can only second what Omar was saying, we need to iterate on this. And the way you get to a plan, if you're going to be working on something that's going to last 5 years, it's going to take more than one iteration. It's probably going to take, I would say, at least 5 or 6 iterations before you really get it, going back and forth, refining, revising until it's really in place. So I think this is a good example starting point for a plan. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And I do like the contract and I support it.
Anyone else have any other questions?
I just have one more question. Could you define people of goodwill?
Yeah, generally speaking, I think that is actually a phrase that I use to say people who want the best for the community, whatever they see the best as, but they want the best. They're not necessarily the person who wants to hear herself talk or be the devil's advocate just to be the devil's advocate all the time, or to, be the loudest person in the room. Somebody who is willing to look at the whole system and not at just one slice or one facet through their own child's world only, right? Or through only the 5th grade, or through only the lens of only a tax bill, right? Somebody who can really step back and think about public education in your community for all children.
Any other questions? Okay. So all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Oppose, abstain, motion carries. Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson, for joining us this evening and
I
answering.
look forward to serving your community and to leading great thinkers to really new heights. It's a great thing. Thank you.
We look forward to working with you.
Have a great night, Judy.
Thank you.
Great
Thank you.
evening.
All right. We'll move on to 2.4, recommended action that the Board of Education approves the agreement for services between the Croton-Harmon School District and the Hendrick Hudson School District as presented.
So moved.
Second.
On the question, Neil?
On the question, this is an agreement for a starting date of right now for till the end of this school year. Is there an anticipation that services will be provided for this child after the end of this school year?
Not by our district, no. This would just be for the remainder of this school year.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Oppose, abstain, motion carries. We'll now move into the BOCES administrative budget. Recommended action that the Board of Education approves the resolution for the 2022-2023 BOCES administrative budget as presented.
So moved.
Second.
On the question? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Oppose, abstain, motion carries. Recommended action that the Board of Education approves the resolution for PNW BOCES to establish a Career and Technical Education Program Equipment Reserve Fund, CTE Equipment Reserve, as presented.
So moved.
Second.
On the question? All in favor? Aye. Oppose, abstain, motion carries. Recommended action that the Board of Education cast one vote for each of the 2 vacancies to be filled, provided that no more than 1 vote may be cast for any candidate as defined below. This is for the PNW BOCES board member election.
So moved.
Second.
On the question?
I will just repeat what I said last time, that these are incumbents who are seeking re-election to the BOCES board. And I have over the years had the opportunity to interact with them and believe that they have done a decent job and are qualified to continue.
All in favor? Aye. Oppose, abstain, motion carries. We'll now move into the consent agenda. Recommended action that the Board of Education approves the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
On the question? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Oppose, abstain, motion carries. And now we will move into our work session. So I will turn it over to Superintendent Walker to get us started on our code of conduct review.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to our building leaders for your time being here this evening. I will say the last time this group was in the same room at the same time, I think the meeting lasted 6 hours, so we'll shoot for a little more brevity tonight. But as we think about the concept of restorative practices, obviously districts have been moving in this direction for a number of years. I think it allows us an opportunity to think about student behavior and the student experience within our schools as a series of teachable moments. And that's in my short time in the district, having spent time with each of these fantastic leaders, that's what I regularly see. That the code of conduct isn't about applying language toward a purely disciplinary approach to kids, but it's about looking at that concept of when a student engages in behavior that is not what we and they desire. It becomes about how do we figure out how that young person can take accountability, take responsibility, learn from the behavior, mend relationships that may have been harmed through their behavior, either with another student, with the school community, or with themselves. And I think this team does that exceptionally well. And so I want to thank all of you for the work that you do every day to enact this code of conduct and the one that was prior to it. Given that the code emanates, of course, from policy 5300, we want to ask Neil as policy committee chair to share with the board and the team here this evening the proposed changes. And then I know the team will be happy to talk about what this looks like in practice in the building, in our buildings, and take any questions the board has.
Sure. Thank you. The last time that policy 5300 code of conduct was revised, which was in 2018, through a rather extensive process of meetings and having community participation in assessing what we had, we moved toward reflecting principles of restorative practices in policy. And in the intervening, I guess, every 3.5 years or so, we have had experience, which I know our administrators will be talking about, of implementing restorative practices. The changes in the document, which you see highlighted in track changes, focuses on making more explicit or specific the principles of restorative practices and how not only students, but everyone who interacts or is part of our community will be working together if there are issues. One of the changes we made a while ago to understand is we don't talk about discipline, we talk about consequences. And that was done a number of years ago to make the point that if there is something for which we must take more, a district must take more formal action. We're not going to have it appear to be punitive, because as the superintendent said, our purpose for our students in particular is to learn from your mistakes, learn how to be a better part of the community, and therefore to be able to grow from the experience instead of having the experience define that student negatively. So each of those wordings that you see go towards that, and each of them were suggested initially by NISBA when NISBA came out with a revised code of conduct template, which focused more on principles of restorative justice and restorative practices. I will also point out that there are other changes that have been incorporated that are in other areas, one of them being, you will note in several places, there is a definition of or parentheses with regard to certain items involving the term race, which reads including traits historically associated with race, such as hair texture and protective hairstyles, such as braids, locks, and twists, because by New York state law on the Crown Act, that the fact that someone will be wearing dreadlocks or twists or a quote natural hairstyle, something for which a school district cannot and an employer cannot take adverse action. You will also note that there is an extensive revision to the disciplinary issues for students with disabilities, which is because of an updating of that section that has been reviewed by our Director of Pupil Personnel Services, who says that what is proposed by NISBA accords with the law and accords with our practices. Beyond that, I think if there are any specific questions about items that either are suggested to be added or not, that the board should feel free to raise them during our session tonight. And it is my hope that we will be meeting as policy committee in the next couple of weeks so that we can provide the policy for formal review and then approval by the board. By law, before we approve any changes to the code of conduct, we must notice and convene a formal public hearing, which I would hope the timing is that we can have this on the May 5th agenda for first reading, and then deal with it with public hearing at our June meeting. That's basically what I've got to say about this. And if there are any questions about anything in there, please feel free to ask and we'll talk about it.
You know, I know that the board has had an opportunity to review the edits to the document. I'm wondering if the sake for building a common understanding about what we mean when we say restorative practices for our community, if it might make sense to review as part of this meeting, the first major edit on page 2, which so nicely really encapsulates what we're talking about in terms of, you know, going back to what Mr. Walker was saying about being an educational process instead of a punitive process.
Well, I mean, I can pull this thing up to page 2 and then we can go through it. What you will see on page 2, I mean, actually, you start on page 1. What we are talking about is appropriate conduct and strong character, this is added language, are reflected in a civil, respectful, healthy and caring environment. So what we are talking about in terms of using restorative practices as part of our code of conduct is trying to inculcate that for everyone in the community and then in the school community. And then, as we said, the language that is added at the recommendation of NISBA and as discussed by our committee, is the highlighted language on page 2. Student discipline and support policies and practices will be implemented in a manner which is caring and equitable, respectful, and based on trust among administration, staff, students, and families, and holds all individuals accountable, but is restorative and solutions-oriented rather than solely punitive. This will help students learn from their mistakes, as was said before, understand why their behavior was unacceptable, acknowledge the harms they caused or the negative impact of their actions, understand what they could have done differently, take responsibility for their actions, learn pro-social strategies and skills to learn in the future, and understand that further consequences and/or interventions will be implemented if their unacceptable behavior persists. Now, there are a couple of different parts to that. The first is learning from your mistakes and understanding how you could have done things differently. The second is taking responsibility for your actions. And that's something that I know throughout restorative practices and the items that I'm sure we'll be talking about with our administrators. That's what try to do. You want students or staff, whoever it is, to take responsibility and understand why that occurred and to learn skills for the future. And so those are all, now a couple of the points I want to raise with regard to that last bullet. There are some forms of conduct that are not amenable to restorative practices because either by law or by the nature of that conduct, the administration may, and the suggested policy states that the administration, superintendent or building principal will have the responsibility and authority to move directly out, toward the consequences, whether they are suspension or something that is either more than suspension, like expulsion, or less, like some of the other consequences mentioned in, I think it's section 8 of the policy of the code of conduct. So there is, so it's not just that any bad thing that happens is going to go through this process. It's going to be as appropriate as a teaching and learning device, but also understanding that code of conduct is meant to ensure that we have a safe environment. And so if there are situations in which administration feels they must move directly to the consequences set forth in section 8, one or more of them, they will do so. But one other thing I forgot to mention, that the policy changes have moved away from gendered pronouns. So you will see that, and I believe this is, I caught all of it when I did the editing, that we are referring to individuals by the word their rather than he, she, him, her, his, her, so that we are being inclusive with regard to those members of our community who do not identify by either he or she. John, was there anything else you wanted me to bring?
That's well done, thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Great work. This is definitely a step in the right direction, I think, in terms of where all the research is pointing in terms of restorative practices and improving behavior in children, teaching them the right skills to navigate life. I have a question on page 4, I think it's 14, is F9. That says the infusion of civility education, ensure the infusion of civility education in the curriculum.
Mhm.
Can we talk a little bit more about that? Sure. I love the concept. I should love to understand it a little bit more.
Yeah, this is, the term civility education is not one we usually use. So that's why you probably pick it up. Certainly, I think what we commonly refer to it is character education. that is really infused within our approach to building character, which is certainly a component of our curriculum K through 12. I think, and I could point to our building principals who could speak most articulately about it, but with all of the, the programs that we have, whether it be First Step in the classrooms or whether it be our guidance programs that push in to teach our REACH acumen acronym K4, all the things we do in terms of our advisory programs, which is a formal curriculum, in the upper levels, certainly is based around civility education.
I would add, though, that the term, I don't recall whether this is something that might be mentioned in anything that comes from state ed, but I think in a way, civility education is perhaps both more narrow but broader in a way than character education. And it can be some kind of a, I guess, bias, if you will, if you use the word character education, because there are certain people who are gonna, may have a certain idea of what is someone of good character, and that may be something that differs from another person's meaning. But I think within our community, we're all looking for civility, and that's, I think, why that term actually, to my mind, is a little better than character education, although it's similar.
This is putting down on paper things that the building leadership is already doing with the curriculum in the classroom.
Yes,
Is that correct?
that's correct. That's right. This might also be a nice opportunity to transition to hear from our building leaders. If we could maybe starting with the high school and working backwards.
Set it up nice.
Thank you. For teeing that up nicely for the team. Dr. Duback and Mr. Maxon, tell us about how this lives at the high school.
Sure, jump in. So at the high school, we've been working very hard on sort of an action research method to working on restorative approaches. So restorative approaches, as we've kind of heard already, are often thought about in terms of consequences and alternatives to suspensions, and that's definitely a part of it. But it's also a mindset and a way of thinking about discipline and how students learn and grow, which we've heard already. But I think where you really see the impact of restorative approaches at the high school is on building culture. So restorative approaches kind of contribute to a culture of support and a culture of multiple hands on deck at every level of infractions. So sometimes approaches involve counselors, coaches, teachers, administrators, and approaches to issues often involve connecting students and families with resources and ongoing support as part of the process. So there's sort of the end result and then all of the other pieces of support that come along the way. And sometimes, as we know with students, issues are a one-off mistake that students make that they can learn from fairly quickly. And sometimes the issue is really a symptom of something more significant going on in a student's life. So the approaches can vary depending on, whether this is a one-time issue or an ongoing issue. But I think that building culture among staff and students is really kind of the tangible fruits of restorative approaches for us at the high school. I think possibly a more concrete product of our work is that we really rarely have out-of-school suspensions and have very little recidivism. I believe over the last 2 years, there actually haven't been any out-of-school suspensions at the high school. We really have been trying to employ other options, even when we need to have a more traditional consequence, like in-school suspensions when necessary, so that when students are serving those consequences, they're here with us, and throughout the day, teachers check in, there's counseling support, and that kind of thing throughout the day keeps the students connected to the school while still being accountable for whatever happened. So we can share a few brief examples of situations where we've utilized restorative approaches on a more sort of day-to-day basis. I'll just give a couple of generic examples. So one example is a situation where some members of an athletic team engaged in some inappropriate behavior. And in that situation, we worked with the coaches, the families, and the students on the team, and they engaged in an educational assignment where they learned about the context of their actions in the athletic world. And it really became a real learning experience rather than a traditional punishment that really focused on your role as the member of a team and what that means. Another example is two students who engaged in a physical altercation. In the past, something like that might have resulted in an immediate out-of-school suspension. But as part of our work, we engaged in a series of mediations. The students did some reflective writing on the situation to one another. They had some counseling sessions. And probably most importantly, the students were actually assigned to helping periods, because one of the root causes that we developed through, or that we identified throughout the process, was that the students were kind of struggling with connection in school and academically a little bit. So those students ended up not having any further issues with one another, but I think long-term really ended up more connected to the school and feeling a little bit more part of the community. And I think the last example is about things like vaping. So in the past, when vaping, was first sort of came out, that was handled very differently in a primarily punitive approach. Whereas with restorative approaches now, we often begin with students engaging in a series of 4 to 6 educational sessions with our student assistance counselor as a way to connect the student to that person, but also to unpack decision-making from a learning standpoint. So those are just sort of a few examples of what's becoming a day-to-day approach for how we work with our students, considering both those consequences when they're needed, but also the learning experiences for our students. And much of this sort of restorative work was already being done at the high school in different places. And we've been shifting over time, sort of scaling it up to the sort of higher level infractions and how we can expand restorative approaches to that cadre of responses that we might employ. So it doesn't mean that there are never traditional consequences for us at the high school, but these practices have expanded our toolkit and helped us kind of grow in our culture of both accountability and support. Am I missing anything?
You did that really well. I think we had a little conversation about recidivism, like how many times do we see the same problem? And it's not never, and I think the cases where we see someone who's repeating a mistake, really, we can, as we talk about it, we realize it's where we really haven't yet identified a root cause. And a lot of times we're working through the process of working with the student, working with the parents, working with the teachers to try to figure out really what's behind the behavior that we're seeing. And it takes a little while sometimes. So, it's not that we never have a repeat issue, but it's definitely a little different process than what we would have done, just a few years ago.
Yeah, I just have a question for Laura and for Mark, which is we started at the end of the process, so to speak. And we're talking about things, and the examples you gave were things that we would hope that our students will be able to carry forth with them when they leave our district and when they are going on to either the work world or going on to further education, and so that they're able to handle the challenges and pressures, which may be even greater than the challenges and pressures in this in this building. What have you found in terms of, and maybe it's a little too early to know that, how that seems to have related to the, I'll call it the mental health and the civility and the character, whatever words you want to use, of our graduates? Or is that something that you really can't tell?
I mean, I think it's, it's hard to, we've been sort of at this for a little over 2 years. We had, a little pandemic in the middle there. But I think from a learning standpoint, something that happens in 9th grade, for example. So prior to restorative approaches, even in things like internet, to qualify for like international travel, National Honor Society, and different types of accolades and awards at the high school, you were almost automatically out of that pool previously if you had any kind of suspension or major disciplinary action. So through, as this is just one example. So through that learning process, now when something happens in 9th grade, part of our restorative approaches in our conversation is this is not, this isn't a determining factor. This is not going to change the trajectory of what happens in high school and what your opportunities are, as long as you're able to learn from it. So I think we're through this, approach, we're able to be really transparent with students that people make mistakes. Things happen in high school. And the goal is to learn from it so that as you are getting older and making decisions throughout high school, you kind of know what's on the table, that it's okay, things happen, but you can grow and learn from them and still have the opportunities that everybody else has in high school. So that might not fully answer your question, but I think that's kind of the starting point, is knowing what the trajectory could be.
If I could expand upon that, I think that really is touching upon, I think, an ultimate goal for why we do what we do. And it points to a very simple reality that we all live in human skin. And because of that, we are always going to make mistakes. And in our adult world, we all know people who make mistakes and do not handle it well. And we know what a debilitating quality that is to their lives. And the ultimate reason why we want to undertake this kind of a mission as part of our system is because it's not if you're going to make a mistake in life, it's when you're going to make a mistake in life. And what this process is doing is getting them to understand that that is okay. Well, okay in quotes, right? It's not okay, but it's inevitable. And that it is how you are able to be reflective about your actions, understand their impact on others, and do what it takes to go through corrective measures. That's the ultimate educational objective of restorative practices. So when you ask like how it carries over, that's going to be great data to try to capture, right? Wouldn't that be fantastic to try to see how people, because they have been Croton students, are able to work through the mistakes when they make them as they go through life would be fascinating. I would say that they will do a better job. That's obviously a qualitative statement. But I would venture to say that they will be better at dealing with the mistakes after leaving our system because of this process.
I think it's also empowering too. So students sort of, through restorative approaches, it's not always, the adults that are making the decisions about what the practice is. It's, sometimes it's part of a conversation with students and families about what some different options are and what would be most likely to repair harm. And so that's sort of a really, powerful experience if you think about it from a student perspective, that you sort of are part of the process of making something right. That's, one of the goals behind it, which I think is a very important growing into adulthood skill.
So to avoid being redundant, anything that Laura said, I thought it would be really helpful for some of our newer board members also to hear the history of how this kind of evolved here in Croton, starting with Ed Furman, who was the first person to provide me with the book of Little Restorative Practices. Yes, John has it, right? And the thing is, I remember when he handed it to me, he goes, "I know you read a lot, but this is a really short book." And the first story in that book about Aruba high school students who let turkeys loose in their school and what happened really moved me, because it illustrates that the most chiseled, hardened, traditional person in the context of this story was able to help a young person find solace and restorative presence in their community after a terrible act. John and I gave the first class on this to faculty members 3 years ago. Laura and other administrators and myself provided a cross-building conversation. And I have to say, it was looked at with a little suspect, because the first thing you're going to have, especially myself, I'll speak for myself, because, I was dean of the school once, and I said, well, what are we going to do? We're going to just have no rules? That's the first thing that you're going to think about. But when you start to delve into this, you realize that you have never been able to work so closely with students in a focus that is totally committed to the student, not to the rules that they broke. It's not about breaking who broke what rule. It's about who was harmed and what are we going to do to fix that. And when you change that focus, you begin to see children grow, Adults grow too, because it's not easy for anyone to kind of navigate adversity. But this is definitely a helpful thing. So at PVC Middle School, because of our work, we've been able to create a peer mediation program. And again, I'm going to say that none of this work is done and we can't put the stamp of finality on it yet, but it's an ongoing process that will continue to evolve. This is a program that gives students an opportunity to serve their community. We've created a manual, a training for the students, and has been applied widely to situations that it's applicable. So when two kids have a problem at recess, what do? We said we need to get them into peer mediation. And we call our mediators down and they come down and they mediate it. And in those cases, we've had very little recidivism or reoccurrence. They sign an agreement, parents are notified, and it goes into the file. So they're agreeing that they recognize the other person's standpoint, that person recognizes theirs, they come up with a solution to how they're going to avoid this problem in the future. And also owning the situation better than any suspension or lunch detention can do. You know, I could survive a lot of lunch detentions when I was a kid. But if someone would have put me in a room and said, you have to fix it with this person, that's a hard task. It's also a task that you're going to have to do some serious reflecting. Some of our other restorative practices are the conferences that we regularly hold. And when I say regular, I mean, you know, maybe a couple a week. These not only help kids solve problems, but also help them be part of a model in unpacking conflict resolution skills. So to Neil's question, I'd like to speak to that at the end. We also, as part of our core routine, have a connection circle, which is more of a preventative restorative piece, where we sit down and we talk about things that are important to us as individuals so that we can create a group dynamic that strengthens the relationships. One of the things that I really like about that is we've been doing that with the faculty of faculty meetings whenever possible. Why? Because if you don't do it with the faculty is not going to be able to do it with the students. The other thing is we've had really powerful moments with teachers with simple questions about them. And what kid doesn't like to talk a little bit about themselves? Some people say I do. But we also, like I said, have ongoing growth opportunities for teachers and staff. And restorative practices, it's not that you abandon traditional discipline. It's you find the time and the space for the restorative practice to be incorporated into that discipline. So when Neil said that if something really egregious happened, we wouldn't think about restorative practices, I would say to that the timing for the restorative practice would change. But sooner or later, that child, that person has to be reintroduced into our community and let them know that they can go forward as a member of our community. Yes.
Yeah, I just, somewhere in here, and I'm looking for now, and I think I'll find it. We do say, among other things, when we are talking, and I think this is on page 36. Students who participate, this is in the suspension, students who participate in restorative practices ending in a restorative conference and written agreement, it's for pretty serious violation if we have a suspension, may be permitted to return to school sooner than those who do not. Early return is up to the discretion of the administration. The other question that was in here, and I'm trying to find where it is that it said something about, early return from a long-term suspension, which would be in the authority of the superintendent after that suspension, long-term suspension is made and going through those processes. And in talking about that, one of the things that is said is that the utilization of restorative practices such as you described, conferences, etc., was something that the superintendent may utilize to allow students to return and prior to serving the full length of a long-term suspension. And I think that, and I know we had discussion in the committee about what that means And obviously, we haven't utilized that because we haven't had any suspensions for several years, almost 2 years in the high school. And I don't know about the middle school or elementary school, but that seems to me to carry over to the same thought that if it's learning, if even if you've been severely punished, to use that wrong word, but punished by a suspension, there is a way through using these restorative principles to rejoin the community and rejoin the community in a positive manner.
If I could just piggyback on your comment, Neil, we had the benefit as a policy committee when we were kind of discussing this to have Lauren Scollins with us that day. And it was actually Ms. Scollins who pointed out what you were just saying right now about the timing and about using these restorative practices to reintegrate a student and to have them connect to the community. So I want to thank you for being there and for allowing us to have that element highlighted during all of this. But that was it.
So to finish up, Neil, basically what I'd like to also just point out is how well at a middle school level, why this is so important. Obviously, we understand the developmental realities of our kids. We also see the connection between the ruler work we're doing and restorative practices. Ruler also has their own restorative piece in their blueprint. But to answer Neil's last question, which is how do we see this panning out beyond the school and the application beyond the school, I would just ask us to look at the profile of the graduate. Understanding that the restorative practices like a conference will help students develop each one of those skills. Critical thinking and problem solving. You're asking kids to be problem solvers, and you're asking them to problem solve something that isn't a derived problem from a teacher. It's a problem that's affecting them. I could go down the list. I'll spare you that, but I will say that the most important one is empathy. The other thing I will add is that when we begin to engage in restorative practices and approaches with kids, what we're telling them is we expect an expenditure from them. We expect them to contribute to our community, but we're also showing them that we're willing to make the investment. You can't get an expenditure without getting the investment in there first. Lauren, would you like to talk about an example?
Sure. My parents called it the emotional bank account when I was growing up. And that's how they did another Catholic joke maybe, but that was part of it. We've had really powerful conversations, and to Michael's point, it starts with the staff. And one of the most powerful conversations we had was one of our first faculty meetings in person after the COVID time. And that was our focus of the faculty meeting, was just to get into our circles and reconnect with one another. And now that is a core routine in our advisory work. So today for advisory, the topic was, what is your best self? See your best self. That's one of the core things in Ruler. And when you make that mistake, not losing sight of what your best self really looks like. And that was a huge conversation with my group today as they wrote on pieces of paper what they valued about themselves and others in the classroom. And they couldn't copy what the person from ahead of them wrote, which was the first question I got. But another, key pieces are peer mediators, and those trainings that we take them through where they role play and they engage in that work. We had a situation with two students at recess, of course. That's where we see a lot of those peer mediation things happen. And they came to us asking for the support of a peer mediator. Last year, we also did a restorative conference when a child was re-entered into the building, and they asked for a peer advocate, so not a peer mediator. They asked for someone on the student council to sit, someone who had also been trained as a peer mediator, to sit with them in that conference, not a parent, not another staff member. They wanted a peer to be a part of that conversation. And I think that's a really powerful thing to say, that we are providing students with leadership experience, but also allowing students who are affected emotionally about the mistake they made, the opportunity to make choices and know how to restore that. So those, I think, are a few key elements to the things and the work we've done. But after those first few connection circles with our staff, teachers have come to us to ask, can you lead that with my class? I'm really struggling with the 6th graders after recess. They go to specials, and that can be a time where things are really hairy. So how can we use a restorative circle or a conference with the whole class to really build that connection with the class and understanding of, how does that teacher feel when everyone comes in covered in sweat and purple and ready to, not speak French. So how can we use that time to really center ourselves, see our best selves, and then learn? I think those are key pieces there.
And the other thing that I think we would love to continue to do is to bring parents up to speed on this work. For some of them, it might be foreign. It's very different than what they experienced. That when I experienced in school, it was, not much restorative practices in like the junior high school that I went to. So we've hosted parent coffees. We've also made this a standing topic on building plan. Every year when we review the PVC code of conduct, we revisit the restorative practices piece and have open discussions about that.
Thank you. And I have to say, I think in my history of having board meetings like this is the first time that we've ever gone from the older kids down to the lower kids. Normally we scaffold it up, so it was a little interesting for
Switch it
me.
up for you.
So, couple things that pop into my mind first is you always hear little kids, little problems. That's true to an extent. We don't have the vaping. We don't have the magnitude of issues at CET that we might have as kids get older. But we take our job of connecting restorative practice and any type of intervention very seriously as it connects to our emphasis on social emotional learning. So we do have little kids and we do have little problems, so to speak, but it is our job to lay that foundation. And our hope is that due to the practices and what we do at CET, it helps students at PVC and then eventually in the high school and eventually out in the public. So, and Steve kind of took my phrase earlier today when he said, we have teachable moments to help our kids grow. And that's really the focus of our approach at CET. It's really about connecting things to social emotional learning. We have children who have, people have heard me say before, momentary lapses of reason. They're not always thinking, they're not always being their best self, but they're not even aware that they're not being their best self. Very impulsive. So what our goal is to, when we work with a student and we put interventions in place, that we don't see that same behavior repeated again. I might see that same child come to my office the next day, but my hope, and I'll know I've done something right, if they're there for something different. So if they're there for being disrespectful to a lunch monitor on Tuesday, Wednesday, they may be there for something else, but my hope is that we've put measures in place for them to not make that same mistake twice. So some of our approach includes, from a very young age, kindergartners, having a reflective time, talking about how did you feel, what happened, how did you feel when that happened, how do you think the person you were working with felt. And we have reflection sheets and time to think sheets at different levels. So we have a primary one that involves even drawing an illustration about the incident that occurred. And then we have secondary ones where they fill out information. Then we have one where a student fills it out right from the beginning, like what responsibility did they take? What did they do? What could they have done differently? We teach children to answer the questions about what can you do to make things right? Is there anything you want the person that was affected by your behavior to hear? What do you think would help to make that person feel better? If this happened to you, what would you want to happen now? So that ties into what Lauren said about that empathy building piece. That's such a key component of our approach to restorative practices at CET. When we revised our Tiger Cub contract, our elementary code of conduct in 2019, we actually took the word consequence and punishment out of it completely. The top part of our code of conduct rubric says interventions. It's what are we putting in place to help and support these children. So again, they're not making the same mistake twice, they're building empathy. A couple of examples that I can give you that have been very recent, actually. So this year we had our outdoor eating option for the first time. For little kids, that's like, woohoo! There are no four walls holding me in. And so in the beginning, we had a lot of issues with kids leaving garbage, like they're just thinking I'm outside and now I'm free to go, or not behaving in the same way they would in a building, in a seat that they did outside. And there was a lot of conflict, repeated conflict between a group of fourth grade students and a lunch monitor. And what we ended up doing was bringing them in the room together, talking, sharing their thoughts. And then one of the things that we did to help with that empathy building is we had students shadow that lunch monitor during their recess period. They didn't get to have recess. And so what they did was shadow. They got to see what the job was like from the eyes of the person that was in charge of that role, and then had a reflective piece after that. What did you learn about? What impact do you think your behavior had on that person's day and how they made it through the day? We also did that with a custodian. There was some vandalism in the bathroom, stuffing the toilet with paper towels or whatever. And same thing for a recess period. We had a child shadow the custodian during that time and see what they had to do. We never take away recess without it being purposeful. I grew up in a time when it was, you lose your recess. Well, to me, some of these kids that are acting out this way need recess more than anything. They need to be active. They need that free time. But what we have found is by taking that short period of time and shadowing that person and watching what impact their behavior had on that person's day is a huge play area to grow. And most recently, we had 4 fourth grade girls had a real issue at recess time. It was a battle over the fourth wheel in a group of 3 that were close, and they got really emotional, and it actually turned physical and turned verbal. And they came into our office, and we talked first to one group of kids because it was almost like 2 and 2. And we talked to one group, we talked to the other group, and then we asked, would you be comfortable if we all talked together? Because there is that concern about putting somebody who has been harmed with the person who did that without consent for that. They all agreed that it was okay. And without getting into a lot of detail and long story short, by the time kids finished sharing, one child said, I had no idea that you were going through that at home. I can't imagine what that would be like for me. And another one said, because someone had lost a grandparent, I'm so close with my grandmother. I can't believe that that's what you're dealing with. I had no idea that's why you were upset. And the empathy and the bringing them together, that they understood they were never going to be the best of friends. They didn't skip out of my office making plans for recess the next day, but what they did was walk away with an understanding of what people bring into the world, what people bring into their day, and how that can impact their behaviors. And so we have found that just by opening up the conversation and having that focus on empathy is really the foundation that we want to build in order to make hopefully PVC in the high school's lives a little easier when they get to you. So I don't think, Neil, I have to look so far as into how they are when they start work, but I'm interested in like the data from CET going into PVC. That's data we could track. If we looked at incident reports from when these same cohorts were in CET as opposed to now at PVC, that's data we could look at with these practices. I feel like the job of looking at your kids when they graduate is a lot harder, but we could easily track cohorts of children and incident reports as they move from CET into PVC and so on. So that's really where we are at CET, and something that we take a lot of pride in because it is the foundation of our social emotional learning.
So I have a 2-part question with respect to all of this. And I know that in the policy committee, we addressed the option parents have to sometimes opt out of restorative practices. So I guess I want to know how that plays out at the different levels. And I also want to know at what point parents are informed of whatever restorative practices you're doing and that impact that has on actual classroom and education time. Because it sounds worthy, but very time consuming. And I wonder if that happens after school hours or.
So at CET, parents are notified right away. We try to get to the parent before the kid gets back home because a kid's going to come off a bus, they might be upset, they might be embarrassed, they might be emotional. And so we always like to, as best as we can, talk to a parent before they see their child so that they have an understanding of what happened. And a lot of what we do, it doesn't, like that whole incident with those 4 girls only took about 10 minutes right after lunch. So it wasn't like it took from a lot of instructional time. And the shadowing and that type of practice takes place within the school day. So we try not to have that impact instructional time. If a child is really in crisis and needs some time with counselor, that may, and again, a parent is informed right away at CET if they're involved in that depth of a intervention.
I'm laughing because full disclosure, I've had these conversations with Michael, so I have 3 kids at EBC right now. So I know how it happens.
Depending on what we're dealing with, would depend on the contact with the parents. Obviously, we're dealing with something pretty mild, that might not be contact with the parents. Like if 2 friends came and just said, hey, you know, we're really having a hard time, and they went to their counselor, the counselor might say, hey, we need to have a sit down and do a restorative conference. But for most of them, you know, we like to keep the parents not only informed, but updated about how the conference went. So if it was a more, let's say, egregious act where a child or a friend hurt another friend, there would be an immediate notification of both parties. And then the assertion that a restorative approach would be used once the right timing was there to use it. Then there would be a follow-up with those parents to say this is how it went. And what I found about that is that, you know, when we start talking in restorative language, that parents are thinking themselves about how they could support their child at home in a more restorative way. So which would you rather hear from a parent? Well, I'm going to punish this child over the weekend, which is their right to do. Or, you know, I'm going to talk to my child and see what else we could do to support them. And I think, you know, both have their place, but I'm really concerned about the second piece, because some children, especially in today's day and age, need more support in other ways that they can get, and this might open up that door. As I told you in the peer mediation piece, we have a signed contract that goes home to the parent. And so that's good. And you know, the other thing is I think due to our efforts and the wonderful community that we work in, parents are not only open for this, they sometimes suggest it. So that's been very helpful. Obviously, if, you know, a gaggle of students have a small problem, we're not going to, you know, call every parent and say, hey, did I tell you, you know, this is what's going on, and we did a restorative conference. We also want them to have ownership and know that we don't always have to call your parent, because we think you're the responsible party in this. And that's a powerful message in and of itself.
And I'll add on to that there are sometimes not just parents who aren't comfortable, but students who aren't comfortable in that conversation. So making sure that we have that avenue for them to have that ability to say, you know, Mrs. Collins, I know that you're meeting with the other 5 girls, but I'm not comfortable with that. And then, you know, making sure in that situation where there is a gaggle of girls in the office conference are waiting for me, that, you know, we take 2 different approaches and reach out to the parents if someone isn't comfortable in that way. So I think it's a lot of balancing act there. But I think in middle school, it is about finding that, you know, can you stand up for yourself? Can you find that you're starting to, you know, you're graduated from CET, you're into the middle school, you're not yet at the high school, you know, where are your own legs here to stand on? And that first time where you're in the office and we're all talking at once and learning the rules, the second time maybe really where we're going to reach out and have more formal conversation.
The other thing, Anna, to answer your question is, does it happen during the school day? Yes, but not only during the school day. There's been conferences that have happened after school and even over the summer, when students have had problems outside of school, where parents reach out to us for help. One of the instances a couple of years back, right before the pandemic, was a problem that happened in town after school involving one of our students and another student from the high school. And we were able to help them, both of them, to go into town together after all things have settled. And you know what I find is that in these conferences, people, you know, don't come out and go, wow, that was great. But it does fix the problem. And people have to own up to what they did and say, this is how we're going to coexist in and of the least.
I think at the high school, time is really important, because I think in almost every situation where we would engage in any kind of mediation or conference, doing it the day something happened is never a good idea. There's usually, you know, through more conversations, there's a story that's several layers deeper than what we initially discover. And it's really important to give students time and space to reflect before they engage in any of this work. And normally what we do with students is we give them 3 options in terms of contact with their parents. They can be in the room, say, with me while we call their parent, and they can talk. They can be in the room and listen to what I say to their parents so that they can be a part of the conversation. Or they can go home that day, talk to their parents about what happened, and then we can call together. So it kind of, you know, developmentally gives students a choice as they get older and how they want to process and approach the situation, which I think is, you know, something really important and empowering for students too. But for us, a lot of the work will happen during the school day. You know, we try not to pull students out of classes, but we have the benefit of things like free periods and longer lunch periods at the high school where we can do this kind of thing too. And help.
You know, and there's a lot of cases where it's the most important thing that's going on for a student is what just happened.
And they can't engage in class, you know, if that's not taken care of. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Couple of things. First of all, I want to commend the district for this work. We started talking about this, feels like a long time ago. But it's multi-year work, and I really do commend the district for the administration for working on this. For moving us away from sort of the old-fashioned kind of approach where there were kids who in the olden days, kids got labeled as bad kids, and that would stick and affect them over a long period of time. And I think this is a great way of avoiding that and ensuring that small problems don't turn into big problems, don't turn into persistent problems. So I really appreciate the work that's being done in this regard. And the understanding that there is a road to redemption for every student. You know what, I'll just leave it at that.
Anyone else have any
I
questions?
just had one question. So I think it's great that you, it sounds like there's not a lot of reoccurrence for children who engage in these practices. I'm just wondering, do you find it affects the number of incidents that occur or situations and in a positive or a negative way? Like, does it go up or down? I'm just wondering, you know, do kids talk and they're like, oh, you just have to, you know, engage in a circle? Like, does it affect it at all in terms of the number of incidents? Have you seen it increase over time?
I would
or-
say at the high school level, it's an open question.
Mhm.
You know, we just finished two very abnormal years when it comes to discipline,
Mhm.
particularly at the high school level. Incidences in every school have been way down in the last 2 years, incidents of anything.
Mhm.
And when you think about it, if you don't put everybody together, there's just a lot less incidents,
Mhm.
right? And that's where we've been the last 2 years. So, you know, this is an experiment that's about that old. So I would say we don't know yet.
So things have been pretty constant at the middle school with this type of stuff we deal with, because let's be honest, the kids are gonna, at that age, they make the typical mistakes that they make. So I expect to see those. I expect that they haven't ebbed or flowed. It's just been pretty constant.
Okay.
And look, there are always kids who need help. And what I would ask us is, how do we use that restorative mindset and those thoughts to help kids with everything? And then you can start tailor making restorative, responses to different situations, like what Laura spoke about, or, you know, let's say a kid laughs during a really sensitive time during a lesson, and the teacher took that as disrespectful because they were talking about something very sensitive. How do you make that into the learning opportunity? And I think the shift here is away from the code of conduct rules towards the commitment to the child. Right, so the rules and the code of conduct are very important. They're a guideline, but really, what are we trying to invest in? Which is the child, and that's what we're doing. We're reinvesting.
I think to your point, there's also this element of this is hard stuff to be able to talk about your emotions, and it's in some ways a lunch detention, as Michael said, is much easier. I'd rather just take that and sit there and not have to talk to anyone, and talk to me and all the staff and watch what teachers are coming in and say hi to everyone. But to have to sit there in a room with the principals and the teachers and own, I think that is almost more uncomfortable for them, and a much, the empathy piece that they're learning and growing in such a different way that they walk out, and it's the hope that resonates with them in some way.
I think we hear more of kind of the opposite of, can I just have detention?
Yeah. So that gets through the rumor mill too. Yeah, you actually get uncomfortable. So that's
And
good.
I would say at
Yeah.
CET, we've seen a decrease in the same child, same offense.
Mhm.
So again,
Mhm.
after that particular child had to shadow that recess monitor. I have not had a problem with that child at recess since. And again, it wasn't in a humiliation way. It was like, you need to just see what the impact of your behavior has.
Mhm.
And so I think we have started to see a decrease in the repeat of the same offense by the same person.
And then I just had one question about the peer mediation. I was curious, what is it that is driving the kids to want the peer mediation? Maybe you could just speak to that, knowing,
Well,
children of
one-
that age. I'm just curious.
One, this is something, one of the tools that we would recommend to
Mhm.
them. But also, I think that there is an innate desire of our children to want to fix what was broken. So let's say we had two kids who had a pushing match at the Gaga pit because, one wouldn't get out and the other thought he was out, but the other guy contends, or the other person contends that he was out. That's not an unreal thing to have, in fact. Pretty.
Pretty regular.
So, just again, provide them choices, here's what we could do about this. And here's what the solution is, or possible solution. And then they agree to that, then we will go forward with that. We also understand that we have the trained mediators who come down, and I think it is empowering to the kids to have other kids work with them. Obviously with a counselor in the room, myself alone in the room, to be able to help them unpack this. And once they get into, so this is how I was feeling, and this is what I need from you going forward. I think it's been very effective.
Middle schoolers also really love to talk and to tell their story over and over.
Great
I'm
point.
sure you're familiar with that. But, and I think that peer mediation piece is an opportunity for them to air their side and then also air the other side. So a lot of times it's on both parties coming in and saying, we need a peer mediation. It's someone coming in and it's spewing and talking and us suggesting, well, have you shared that? That's how you're feeling? No, why would I do that? So then that's where we then go into that piece. And I think the more the word's out there, the more that they know that that's an option now. I like I've done more of them in the 5th and 6th grade side, just based on those kids really feeling like that's a great avenue for them. But we've done them at all 4 grade levels,
And
and
we've
it's been
got the
really
peer
powerful.
mediators sweatshirts that have shaking hands, it says PVC mediated, because we want them to be proud of the work they're doing. They're going beyond the normal expectation of what they're contributing to the school culture.
They apply for it. They have to get a teacher recommendation and a parent recommendation. And we make it feel like this is a huge contribution to what we do here. And they voted for sweatshirts without hoods, so I don't know.
It's been one of the nicer things to work on, really. That and the lunch.
Anyone else have any other questions?
One final question. Have you had any sense of how parents feel about this with respect to, are you seeing pushback, like, you need to be more lenient, less lenient, and conversely, do you have any concerns about and I think you mentioned it tangentially there, about parents going beyond where the school has already done its disciplinary process, and parents perhaps doing things as part of their parenting that is not necessarily aligned with what the school is doing, and perhaps interfering with the.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, look, I don't know specifically what goes on in everyone's home. But I will say that when you have those conversations with parents, you are opening the door. What I found, and I think Ms. Collins would agree, as well as my other colleagues, is that you're opening a conversation, because many times as parents, we're lost to help our kids in a situation. We have lots of mixed emotions, and I don't have to go through all of those for you when our kid makes a mistake. But I find that the parents really trust this process. They might need time to consider it. So for instance, let's say a child hit another child and it was unprovoked, all right? Just to use that as an example. you're not gonna call that parent and say, hey, you know, I want to do this restorative thing, but by the way, your child was hit today. That's something I would wait for a few days. This is to follow up with the parent with. This way, say, hey, this is what I'm gonna do to protect your child, make sure that this doesn't happen again,
Right.
and so forth. And then say, you know, I'm thinking about the two students. They have been very friendly in the past. I'd like to do something to restore that friendship and let your child take responsibility while the other child can explain to them how they were feeling and why this was so wrong, you know, so forth and so on. I haven't had a parent that really ever was against that.
And I think one of the things that we do always at CET is when we talk to a parent, the last thing I'll say before I hang up the phone is if, when your child gets home today, if they share something with you that is either different from what I'm telling you or contradicts or is missing, please call me right back in the morning. Because again, a child might, let's face it, they might be embarrassed, they might be nervous, they might be anxious or still upset. And there could be a side of something. So I think including the parents and saying, if you hear something different, or if you feel that there's a different side to this that I don't know, you're involving. So it's less of that. How did this happen? What did you do? I don't approve of the way you're doing it. It's really kind of sharing that and having that conversation to say, please let me know if you found out anything else. Because then you can handle things differently, or you might have to take another step. I think that helps parents to be on board with what we're doing at school when they know that there's that open invitation to communicate back if there's something more to the story or another side.
We'll even sometimes, pre-plan the conversations with parents that we're going to have with them and their students. Because I think, to your question, if we're in, a meeting, say with parents and students, and a parent is saying, oh, the school is wrong, or, oh, you're not, going hard enough in terms of consequence, that sends a really difficult message to the student who's sitting there wondering, who do I trust? Who do I believe is right in this situation? So we'll sometimes do that and say it's really important that we all get together and have this conversation. Here's what I'd like it to sound like. Does that work for you? What would you like it to sound like? So that we're almost, can kind of approach it as sort of a team approach to support the student. But again, giving them that time, as Carrie mentioned, when your child goes home, they might share something else with you that we don't know. So, please make sure to let us know what that is. And that, can sometimes happen because kids might have a more trusting relationship with their parents or feel more comfortable sharing that information. And then, rather than in that moment when something just happened. So I think, not making, quick decisions is also really important. Obviously, there's a safety issue, you have to, but giving people that time to process and come to additional information or understandings is really important in this.
Piggybacking on what Josh's question was, and then your answers. Do you find that when, what Michael said, parents, we're kind of lost. We don't know exactly what to do. Do you find that parents in that situation are looking to our schools, our staff, for guidance and resources in parenting, in dealing with issues that may even not be in the school itself, but you've kind of developed or utilized an approach? And then is that an area that perhaps we ought to be thinking about outside of just the school setting in terms of parent education and some of the work that we may do with our community?
I think we did. I was gonna say at CET, we have our behaviorist runs parenting classes, so if there's a child who we're routinely, and Laura kind of said it earlier today, when it's not just the action that you're addressing, it's the root of that action, because there's always, unless it's like just an impulse, there's usually a reason why you're seeing these behaviors. And so when we start to see that as a pattern or a way a child is behaving or reacting, we will have our behaviorist involved. And very often those parents are offered the opportunity for some parenting classes. If it's even more so than that, when we've started the dialogue, once you have that conversation and there's that element of trust and connection, parents have asked us on multiple occasions, do you have are there resources? Is there a list of people? Not that we don't recommend, but if we know that there are providers in the area or resources in the community, then we will share that with parents. So a lot of these conversations and trust building has led to parents seeking additional information to support their child.
That's one of our key functions of the student assistance counselor as well. She works with a lot of our families to connect resources and for exactly that sort of parenting support, especially with substance use.
And also, Neil, you gotta remember that there is other apparatuses in the district that offer those things, like the self committee, right? That does parent university. And like I said, some of the workshops we've done with parents and coffees and so forth and so on. I don't think we can ever take our eye off of that, because I do think that if we're gonna reach out and say, parents, we wanna collaborate with you, we should be ready to come with either with resources of our own to show our expertise and share that, or to say, we don't have that expertise, therefore let's look for it together. So I think that those are really important things, again, just like this, that the work there is never done. Most recently, I had a family reach out to me to help with video games. And it was really interesting because the kids were fighting over video games at home, over the mics that they wear on their heads. And I think we've made some progress. It's some of these problems are tougher and they need more sustained approach.
And I think that's what makes Croton special too, right? We're a small community. And it's not just about one parent in isolation struggling, it's about coming together as a community and being able to have these conversations and having this restorative work go on for many more years before other communities in the area. Because I think that Croton values that and wants to be a part of that, very much that community feeling and supporting one another. And having those partnerships and relationships that they can, send a screenshot of what was happening on video games to us so that we know and are in the loop. Because whatever happens to the Black Cow on Saturday morning and Friday night is going to affect us on Monday and Tuesday, for better or worse. And I think that's, the beauty of Croton and sometimes the curse of Croton.
As someone who
As
grew up
someone who lives
in
and
the-
breathes it every minute of every day, I think
entire
that
life.
there's both sides to that. And I think
Yeah.
that's a powerful piece to what makes Croton special.
Anyone have any other questions? All right, well, I just want to take a second to thank everyone who came to speak to us tonight. As Josh said, it's been so wonderful to see this evolve over the years when we first started talking about it with that book from Dr. Furman 5 years ago. So I'm so glad to see this progression and I really look forward to seeing how we continue to move forward in these practices. So
And
thank you.
I would just be remiss if I didn't say that Craig is influential and it's so important in the role of all of this, but he is at a graduate class tonight. So I wanted to just give that explanation. He is, very much involved in all of this, but
On the
not
restorative
here
practice.
We absolutely understand that. So thank you very much. And with that, recommended action that we adjourn the meeting.
Second.
On the question, all in favor? Aye. Opposed, abstained, motion carried. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening, everyone.